Good morning, everybody, audience, participants. On behalf of Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA, and our special sponsor of this research project and report that we are launching today, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Thank you very much. And we are so honored to have you with us this morning to share our research and our analyses of, it is an understatement at this stage to say it was a momentous local government election on the 1st of November. And so much has happened since that time. It is momentous in a sense that we expected a lot from these elections, and we got even more. It was in many ways expected that the ANC would show some decline, that opposition parties would rise into that space. That came true in some ways, and that helped define this moment that we are finding ourselves in which local governments have to be constituted, local governments that are, to a large extent, around a third of them are coalition governments. And that is the other way in which this election delivered so much more than what we had expected. We expected coalition governments, but the fact that they went up from 27 to 70 is quite far-reaching. Five metropolitan municipalities and 65 local municipalities. And what followed in the wake of those election results, that is really the topic of our report. And this report follows through on our book of Marriages of Inconvenience, released in August 2021, in which we had anticipated local government elections delivering so many more to coalition governments. And yet, the election results went further, delivered more than expected. And in the aftermath, the coalitions that have been formed, and in some places are still being formed. So our research report is really a snapshot of what is unfolding in this first month. It's a definitive period, enough for us to have decided to deliver a research report on this, because it sets the template, it sets a framework for so much of what is following, not just in this immediate time where we see so much political dynamics unfolding, but really in the 5 years to come. It's a new epoch, not just in party politics, those tectonic plates of party politics and political identity in South Africa potentially changing, but local government having almost, and I don't think that is dramatizing it, a last chance to show that they can actually be constructive, social justice oriented, effective government and deliver that. But we pause here, and in this report of us, thank you very much. It is art. It is on MISTRA's website, being released this morning. And our communications officer, Mcebisi, again, was just posted the link in the chat column. This report is now officially launched. And we really invite our esteemed audience. Thank you very much for joining us, audience. I see so many big names, interested names, and on the guest list, people who are registered and are attending. And we really hope that this report from MISTRA will be a great trigger into debates, into constructive debates, taking forward, into monitoring how the lessons that we have highlighted in Marriages of Inconvenience, the lessons that we do not often see adhered to in the last month of local governments, coalition governments forming, but we look forward to monitoring that with much participation and inputs from people we have in our audience too. So to the audience, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate you taking the time at this time of the year to share this moment with us. I believe this may be one of the very first elections reports that are being analyses that are being released about the elections. And we are very happy to say that it offers you more than just the elections analysis, but also very much the landscape, the early landscape of local government coalition politics in this particular 2021 to 26 epoch. To audience, our program for the rest of the morning is going to, this part of the morning is going to be first, Executive Director from MISTRA, Joel Netshitenzhe, will take over very soon and give a strategic interpretation overview of the elections. After that, I will take a few minutes and just summarize the big, broad framework and what I see as the major trends emerging. And then it will be over to our wonderful panel and other authors who are in the audience. In convening this project, MISTRA found it wise to convene a set of authors, experts in their fields, researchers, to take a few stabs at this unfolding phenomenon. And we've got 19 analyses in this research report. Several by authors have more than one in it, but it is a wonderful collection of individual analyses, not just of the broader framework, the legal constitutional framework, and the role of youth. How is youth coming into these elections and coalitions politics, and the legislative and agreement frameworks of coalition formation, but we have analyses of all of the coalition metros and include Cape Town in that, with a question asked by the author of whether in future there could be a return to coalitions in the city of Cape Town, perhaps not as safely consolidated as a one-party government there as had been in recent past. And after that, we also moved to clusters, provincial clusters of coalition politics. And this is also a wonderful, very rich part of research and analysis in this report that we are releasing today. And we look at different provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, Northern Cape, Free State, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Gauteng, you name it. We have got these provinces because, of course, in this election, it was the first time that coalitions occurred across all 9 of South Africa's provinces, and in several places in greater numbers than before. And we shall, in due course, in the next hour or so, get to several of these inserts on these coalitions in provinces and metros. And I look forward to the discussions. I hope you will be reading and participating in this discussion, both today and going forward, all of the audience. Thank you very much. So with that broad overview of the program, then it is over to MISTRA's Executive Director, Joel Netshitenzhe. Good morning, Joel, and thank you very much. It is over to you for a strategic overview of this local government election. Thank you very much.
Good morning to all the participants, and thank you, Susan. I wish to start off with the assertion that the 2021 local government election was a unique snap poll. Most political parties had argued for and expected a delay, but the Constitutional Court, of course, had other ideas, and everyone was thrust into frenzied hustings. The outcome contains many salutary signals, but to extract future trends from this, we need to differentiate between the general and the particular. Just to cite a few peculiarities, there is the COVID-19 pandemic, which had just passed the peak of its 3rd wave. Secondly, the campaign period was short by South African standards, and there was a general sense of underpreparedness among all parties. Thirdly, although the IEC met expectations, a few undertakings, such as voter education and the registration weekends, were circumscribed. Fourthly, the election was held on a Monday, creating a long weekend effect, and this at month end. Lastly, many parties face the challenge of resources because of the economic situation and the new party political funding regime. These factors affected parties' ability to enthuse their voter bases. And so at about 46%, voter turnout was the lowest ever, though we should remember that in 2000 and 2006, the turnout was around 48%. But it would be wrong to overplay the unique features. Many other realities, including dismal service provision, especially in poor communities, influenced the outcome. We can add to this intense frustration with corruption all the way to national government, as well as economic performance and a sense that the country is not going in the right direction. Now, before looking at the results in perspective, which is quite an achievement given the earlier intemperate statement by some of the parties against the IEC and the Constitutional Court. Now, what do the results tell us? If you look at the top 10 parties, compared to 2016, the Freedom Front Plus, the Patriotic Alliance, and of course, Action SA performed very well, though from a small or zero base. To a lesser extent, this applies to independents. The IFP and EFF experienced marginal increases, though the EFF seems to be leveling off, being overtaken as the third largest party by Action South Africa in Johannesburg, but making huge gains in KwaZulu-Natal, for instance. As we know, the ANC and the DA experienced large drawbacks at a national level, and the ANC dropped below 50% for the first time. In relation to the provinces, the ANC declined by more than 9 percentage points in 4 of them. And in the Western Cape, the DA declined by some 9 percentage points. In other words, the outcome cannot be attributed to a single factor. There is also the issue of spatial concentration. For instance, while at national level, the IFP received just above half of the EFF's proportional votes, its concentrated support in KwaZulu-Natal means that it is able to control many municipalities. On the other hand, the EFF has not emerged as the largest party in a single municipality. What about the strategic threats? The 3 largest parties, the ANC, DA, and EFF, continue to reflect a national footprint, which is important, I think, for the integrity of the nation state. The ANC continues to decline in metros and large towns. And while the so-called black middle class is relevant in this, we should remember that with internal migration, these areas have among the highest percentages of people below the minimum living level. Now, from the point of view of the national question and identity, the fault lines of apartheid continue to dominate. Further, the DA has not reversed its losses in the white Afrikaner segment. And in the colored community, a growing sense of marginalization and assertion of narrow consciousness seem to be afoot. What about parties' ideological positions? It may be a bit of a stretch, I think, to impute direct linkages in a local election. But the dramatic entry of Action SA in Gauteng and the resurgence of the IFP in KwaZulu-Natal may suggest a slight rightward shift in the ideological center of gravity. On marriages of convenience, of course, the other colleagues will deal with coalitions. Broadly, the post-election experience bolsters the argument in the MISTRA book on marriages of inconvenience, including that there should be workable agreements for coalitions, and these should be made public. And where formal coalitions are unable to attain a majority, a proportional collective executive system should be considered. And we also need maturity of political leadership and activism by the opposition, civil society, and where necessary, the other spheres of government. To conclude, is November 2021 a harbinger of things to come? This should be examined on the basis of the specific and generic factors that I referred to earlier, as well as how the parties address subjective issues. For instance, how the ANC navigates the divisions that are occasioned by its campaign for organizational renewal, how the DA defines its existential personality on liberalism in as unequal a society as ours, and how the EFF positions itself with regard to the political art of the possible, factional dynamics in the ANC, and its penchant for hyperbole. All these subjective factors will be crucial going forward. It can also be argued that objectively, moments of macro-social crisis, such as COVID-19, poor performance of the economy, and so on, do accelerate generic tendencies that are already manifest in society. In other words, the current trends may be difficult to reverse. Overall, South Africa's theory and praxis on coalitions is seriously deficient. There needs to be serious reflection on this matter. Otherwise, we may end up with serious political instability, not ideal for social transformation, and in a society with social tinder constantly threatening to catch fire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was great to hear those interpretations. And for those who want to read more about it, I do refer you to our MISTRA report. It is posted there. Joe's full piece is available in that report. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Joe, MISTRA Executive Director. To launch the discussion by our panelists and the rest of our authors, and I see questions are already coming in, thank you very much. But to launch the discussion, let me just recap here on a few of the points that emerge in the inserts analyses by the authors in this report. It's fascinating even just to read through the titles. Some of the phrases, the words that come out there give the message of this epoch in which we are living now. Discordant, back to the past, to tectonic plates moving politically, tugs of war, reincarnation of the past, stalemates to the point of flipping a coin, collateral damage being extracted, and yes, returns to coalitions in places where there have not been, enemies and friends, and which is which, that will become friends and enemies at the same time. Double-edged sword, attrition and vacillation. These are just some of the terms and phrases that you find, not just in the analyses, but even just in the titles of these analyses. It gives an idea of the epoch in which we are living. There is a new culture, a new political culture, a new zeitgeist, if I may use that word, that is emerging here. And that is where opposition parties decided to further capitalize, to consolidate the gains that they have been making out of the ANC declining below 50% of the support. And that was an opportunity that the opposition parties in South Africa, hungry for more power after 30 years of undiluted party dominance, that opposition parties have been looking out for. Certainly, the ANC remains dominant in so many respects. It's still dominant in the biggest party in 167 of South Africa's municipalities. It has the outright majority still in 122 of 257 municipalities. So that is not a party that is disintegrated, but yet the curved lines of support indicate that there is a relentless, not unambiguous, consistent, sometimes there are ups again, but there is a consistent overall level of decline in support of the ANC as hitherto dominant parties. And opposition parties now, of course, are going to take advantage of that. And that is one of the biggest side effects of the local election 21 that we have seen in the last months. How opposition parties sometimes are the most unimaginable combinations, excuse me, unimaginable combinations have been banding together and have been forming new alliances. Alliances of different types. And in my piece, analysis number 2 in this report, it is available, thank you very much, in this piece in the report, I do a typology of the different kinds of coalitions that we've seen emerging so far. They come in various iterations, and they're important for us to note because each one has got different implications for stability. Overall, the trend in the different types of coalitions is not one that suggests that we are going to see great amounts of stability in the years to come. There are, of course, also the confidence and supply agreements that parties form a more conditional alliance, and that is definitely one that we have seen quite a few iterations of in the last few months. Also the form that parties just pledge not to oppose, but do not form part of a coalition, but pledge not to oppose in certain places. Of course, this works very well in the current spirit of the time that we have. And we've seen opposition parties come together in what we call united fronts against the ANC, just to remove the edge the ANC out of power in places where the ANC had moved below that 50% outright majority level. So in many of these municipalities, we now see de facto minority governments forming. And we see very often, even in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, the latest announcements There are figures, announcements. Yes, majority coalitions have been formed, but the parties known up to this time are publicly announced. They don't quite add up to that 50%. So we see in this new era of local government in South Africa very much potential for further instability, for minority governments to take shape and to be asked to rule in these municipalities. And so we're getting into an era where there is probably that huge amount of instability. We had hoped that given the negative experiences with local governments and instability in the previous term, 16 to 21, that political parties may be motivated to form more stable, more agreements-based forms of coalition government, but yet this is not happening. It is not going to happen anytime soon, the way I see it unfolding. It could happen, stability could prevail, as long as opposition parties remain united in this front against the ANC, wanting to further consolidate the electoral gains that opposition had tasted after this election. A very important point for us to bear in mind as we move forward in considering these options of stability and instability that we have is what it means for multi-party democracy in South Africa. Does it mean, as we have seen in many debates, or debates here and there, does it mean a maturation of party politics in South Africa, of the political system of multi-party democracy in South Africa, if the possibility of control shifting away from a previously dominant political party, if that becomes a reality? I'm afraid it's not a clear-cut picture that emerges in South Africa, because the opposition parties are often as dismal in their performances, the main ones, as the ANC has been in recent times. And here we see so many options of the small community parties, new and old. Even some old Bantustan parties have themselves dusted off and are winning seats here and there. But mostly it is exciting, interesting, sometimes, as Mcebisi Ndletyana says in one of his pieces, a double-edged sword, because it's not unambiguous where these parties are going to ideologically or identity-wise. But it is a new political reality that across so many of these hung municipalities in South Africa, these political parties are the kingmakers. It is a time of kingmakers, also the time of bigger parties like the EFF, etc., and now Action SA, who are sizable in several very significant municipalities and can swing the balance. And some of the parties have been really declared persona or party non grata in coalition arrangements, where because, as for example, the EFF, it has been had been so disruptive in the previous term, that neither the other two bigger parties, the DA or the ANC, would consider it as a coalition partner, because it would just spell instability. And that is where we get to then to the role of the smaller parties and the different coalitions of small parties that are largely held together. One has to mention that by position, and positions go not just with the top positions of mayors, deputy mayors, and speakers, but with members of the mayoral committees, mayoral executive committees, where that executive system of local government is in place. But it is often coalition, or can I say constellations of seats of small parties that can easily, if we go by the lessons of the previous term, easily switch from one alliance to another one. And that means that these coalitions will have to be kept happy. Sometimes it's up to around 10 of these small parties that help deliver an outright majority to one of the bigger parties. I can think of the ANC in eThekwini, for example. There are many iterations of these constellations of small parties and coalition building that can come to the fore. And as the rest of the analyses this morning and in the report will show, there is a lot of work to be done just to keep these coalitions together. Of course, there are so many different forms of these coalitions that are being manifested around the country. There are by far too many that I can cover in just a few minutes. So I'm going to hand over to my fellow authors in this book, in this report. It's almost as big as a book. Thank you very much. But authors, I really appreciate, and we at MISTRA and FES too, appreciate your inputs into this report and the rich discussions that you bring into the debate. And so thank you very much. I'm handing over to the next person on the agenda, Professor Ndletyana. Mcebisi, thank you very much. You contributed 2 pieces to this book, both on Nelson Mandela Metro and on 3 pieces, my beg your pardon, and on the provincial clusters, not just in the Western Cape, but also in the Northern Cape, to other sites of large numbers of these coalitions. And thank you very much for bringing a few of these very concrete examples into our discussion. Over to you, Mcebisi.
All right, thanks, Sue. I've set my clock exactly for 5 minutes. And I've managed to keep everyone quiet around me here, except for birds just nearby. So I'm afraid I can't silence them. Few things, 3 key points from my side. But perhaps to start off, Joel said 1 or 2 things that caught my attention. The one I guess worth noting as well is the issue of compression of time, insufficient time for a campaign. I guess, yes, comparatively speaking, the period was short. And with the shortness of the period, obviously, you can't go to all sorts of places that you would have liked to go. But my impression was that there was a high level of visibility in terms of campaigns. Well, I'm not sure if one sees from Sentin, watching TV and listening to radio is a true reflection of what is happening around. But my sense of South African society is that it's quite connected in terms of technology. Radio, TV. Yes, of course, for traditional parties that still prefer door-to-door, molweni ninjani, that kind of campaigning. Not being able to access people physically might be a hindrance of sorts, but I'm yet to be persuaded that the shortness of time, relatively speaking, necessarily hampered campaigns. Visibility for me, especially radio and TV, I think made up for inability to physically access people due to insufficient time. That's the general comment that I wanted to make in relation to Joel. 3 points from my side. I won't speak specifically to the 3. I'll speak generally and refer to each case as and when necessary. I think the first point we are arising from the 3 case studies is that this indicates the fragmentation of our party system, obviously. As Joel was saying, the 2 parties lost support even further, and you've had new entrants. I'm not sure, comparatively speaking, if this election has seen a larger number of new entrants than previously. But if I were to guess, I would guess that there are more entrants here than we have seen, new entrants than we have seen in a long while. And so the fragmentation has opened up space for new entrants. But these new entrants are not necessarily attracting new voters into the electoral system, but are eating off by and large from these 2 dominant parties. And so what explains the emergence, the lure of these new entrants into the electoral system? For me, it's a resurgence of nationalism, colored nationalism specifically. You have an assertion of primordial ideas, identities rather, over civic identities. You trust, blood relations. It's better to trust fellow coloreds over Africans because the Africans have been taking care of their own instead of us. And this narrative is very dominant in places like the Northern Cape and even in PE. For instance, in PE, you've had a new party, Northern Alliance, which was pretty much set up and started 2 or so years earlier as an NGO that looked into shortages at schools that were concentrated in the northern areas, predominantly colored areas in PE. And the sense was that the ANC was not doing much. And of course, the Metro government, they kept on saying that, no, the needs of schools are a competence of the provincial government. So there's nothing that we can do. So that provided space because the ANC local, regional ANC didn't attend to this issue. It created a huge sense of neglect and a gripe, which was taken up by this fellow Gary van Niekerk, who set up this Northern Alliance movement, capitalizing pretty much on the neglect of issues and of this schooling matter, which was portrayed as typical of ANC indifference towards the issues that affect colored folks. So right there, exclusion of colors by Africans who are more interested in their own issues emboldened this movement. And alongside that, so I have one or more two minutes left, so I'll try to wrap up. Alongside this, I think Joel alluded to is the instability of the ANC. I think there's a tendency now that we've seen growing up, emerging from the ANC of disaffected personalities influencing the formation of other parties outside of the ANC. I think there was a suspicion that ATM might have been formed through similar initiatives. And certainly in this case, the Defenders of the People DOP came outside of that instability, power struggles within the ANC, set up as an instrument to defend Jacob Zuma and as an instrument to articulate the so-called RET issues. And in PE, quite certainly, it was formed with the involvement of Ndletyana. Yes, as an articulation of JZ issues, but also to take care of other folks who could not join the ANC queue, especially had 1 or 2 councillors who were bought by the ANC, who were previously under DA, bought by the ANC to vote against the DA. I think 1 or 2 of them are now members of DOP. So DOP was set up, one articulation of that disgruntlement within the ANC by Andile and them, ilk, and also to provide positions to get them to join that queue in DOP because the ANC queue was just too long, it could not accommodate them. And last point. So because of this fragmentation, emergence of multiple small parties, you now have parties finding themselves with strange partners as allies in these coalitions. And that has to do mainly because I don't think they planned properly. The results might have taken some of them by surprise, especially the kind of partners that the results sprang up. And now the ANC is having to find itself with PA as a partner. And of course, it was in a tough position because the other possible partner was the EFF. And the EFF, as Joel was saying, just could not exercise the art of the possible, making impossible demands, mainly because the party has set itself up as a kingmaker, a broker in our national politics. So for them to press impossible, difficult demands on the ANC and for the ANC to have agreed to that, that would have validated them really as brokers. So the ANC wanted to avoid that. And so they went for what they thought was a lesser devil. The PA is a patronage-based party. They are all about, give me the money. I mean, that's what Gayton said. I'm going in there to get position and money for my people. And so you are likely to have contradictions, tensions, because you have an alliance of contrasting interests. At least one still thinks of the ANC as as a policy-based party, ideologically based, so they are guided. In most cases, at times you get a different animal altogether, but in most cases, it's all about policy, this and that. But in the PA case, it's all about patronage. And so because of that, and you find that somewhat in PE as well, and in many other provinces. Last point, and the fact that some of these parties are relatively new, they are prone to instability. New parties, they haven't established a tradition of working together. The hierarchy hasn't quite been established. And so they are now being tested because they've now realized that, oops, my involvement in this party has material benefits. And so that creates, triggers a lot of a scramble for position. And in fact, that is happening now with Northern Alliance in PE. They have 3 representatives. Some of their party officials have just emerged yesterday or so, saying they have consulted their branches, and the branches have overwhelmingly voted to recall the three members who are part of council, including the president of the party, who's speaker in that council. So it's a new party. So you have all sorts of hot-headed folks around, and some of them are flexing their muscles. So the newness of parties, the multiplicity, and all these things, I think, make it highly possible that you will have a return to instability. Hence the chapter, Susan, on PE that says forward to the past. It's pretty much an indication of that. All right. Thanks for indulgence, Sue. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mcebisi. Yes, and indeed, audience and other participants, those pieces, analyses are all encapsulated in MISTRA's report. It is there in the chat column. Thank you very much. I'm next going to call on Advocate Jennica Beukes. We invited Jennica onto this project. Thank you very much, Jennica, for becoming part of the project, which she has also written extensively on coalitions and local government, and has got a paper out, a guide on that with the Dula Umar Institute. But Jennica, we are so grateful that you are lending your expertise to this MISTRA project as well. And yes, you will look at the constitutional legal framework that is guiding coalitions. And I may as well throw into the mix, yes, audience, I'm noticing the questions coming in. Jennica, one question that I'm sure you will be addressing just in the course of speaking about the legal framework. And somebody is also wondering from the audience whether further legislation could be enacted to further guide coalition practice in South Africa. Jennica, I don't see you're on screen yet. Are you available?
Hi, Prof. My camera is on. Can you see me?
Yes, we can. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and special good morning to the chair and to the viewers that's here with us today. Thank you for this opportunity and for allowing me with an opportunity to engage with you this morning. So I wrote the chapter on the constitutional legal framework on coalitions. And as stated by myself in this coalition framework and peer de force, currently there's the constitution and legislation doesn't provide any guidance on how coalition governments ought to be negotiated, managed, or structured. And this really causes these political parties to negotiate in the context of uncertainty, often giving rise to unstable coalition governments. So I think while there isn't any express guidance in the legislative framework on how coalitions ought to be put together, the legislative framework nonetheless provides guidance on coalition formation if we read into it. And 2 key areas that I'm looking at is the 14-day time frame and the executive type of a municipality. The report shows that with regards to the 14 days, the 14-day time frame, while it placed pressure on political parties to negotiate coalitions in metropolitan municipalities, this didn't necessarily apply at in local councils like Beto, Laingsburg, and Oudtshoorn, where they've put together coalitions before the prescription of the 14-day time frame. But it also it points to the complexity of the coalition talks in metropolitan municipalities with larger budgets and with larger council sizes, which makes it a necessity for the parties to have more trade-offs in the coalition talks. And as in the city of Johannesburg, this essentially the parties weren't able to reach consensus within the 14-day time frame. Judging by the mayoral composition, which was announced yesterday, it seems to suggest that the Action SA and the DA did in fact come to a conclusion on the coalition talks, and there might be some arrangement going on behind the scenes. But with regards to the 14-day time frame, essentially what this suggests is that it would be ideal for political parties to aim to conclude their negotiation talks within this prescribed 14-day time frame. However, in the context of coalition talks taking longer or being prolonged, which may often be the case in metropolitan municipalities, there is ways to get around it. So a strategy would be for coalition parties to focus on the priority areas which they are in consensus with, and to include an agree to disagree principle in their coalition agreement, so as to remove those issues from the table around which they are unable to establish consensus. And also, in the event that they are unable to reach consensus, then a likelihood that there will be a minority government in place is great. But the likelihood that we will have an election, perhaps not so, because essentially what needs to happen is for the council to then be dissolved. That can happen in one of two ways. First being the council deciding itself that they will dissolve the council. And secondly, with the provincial, or if the provincial government fails, the national government to intervene to dissolve the council. But in both instances, that is an extremely extreme remedy to pursue, and it will most likely only happen if they can prove that they've pursued other less severe remedies, and that it would be appropriate to adopt that remedy in the council. That being said, the remedy of dissolving a council will definitely not follow soon after the parties fail to meet within 14 days, because they would have to prove that their inability to govern together constitutes has an adverse impact on the service delivery in the municipality as a result of the governance crisis in the council. So in terms of the executive system that applies to municipalities, so in this report, I also make the claim that the executive type of a municipality is an important consideration that ought to inform parties' approach to coalition building. And the purpose here is not to say which of the systems are better than the other. I think that has been established already, and it's clear that the executive system can bring more stability in hung councils. But rather, I am concerned with the coalition model that ought to accompany the executive type of a municipality in order to bring about stability in that municipality. So the case of Mcebisi v. Khumalo carefully illustrates that merely having an executive committee system in place in a coalition-led municipality will not magically make coalition government stable. In addition, it's also necessary to find a best fit for each executive system. And in this case, it's important to distinguish then between a minimal winning or bare majority coalition and a grand coalition government. So in terms of the mayoral system is essentially a winner-takes-all majoritarian system in which there's a clear winner and a loser. So the opposition parties' work will then be limited to the council, whereas the coalition parties will assume complete control over the executive. And in this instance, a bare majority coalition that comprises of a few political parties will then fit neatly into the mayoral executive type system, because the bare majority coalition would then be able to insulate itself from the interference of the opposition in the executive, and they will be able to exercise the control that they need in order to implement the coalition program. But copying and pasting this coalition type and expecting it to work in a different context, such as the executive committee system, is unlikely to bring about stability, regardless of the inherent properties that the executive system may contain. So the unintended consequences in that case would be that a bare majority coalition would be forced to tolerate the opposition in the executive committee, who will most likely continue to function as an opposition and therefore also adversely impacting on the coalition governance of the coalition government. So instead, one must have regard to the nature of the executive system as an institution, and contrary to the mayoral committee system, the executive committee system is a consensus model. So for it to achieve its intended benefits, the coalition governance model must therefore also be a consensus model. And grand coalition governments have long been associated with consensus democracy. And a grand coalition government will then expect all parties to cooperate to implement the coalition program in the executive rather than working against each other. And this will immediately remove the conflict that is likely to emerge from having to tolerate an opposition party in the executive. So therefore, in this instance, the law should, though not expressly mentioning anything about the coalitions, it nonetheless guides or to guide parties' approach to coalition formation in local government. And then on the question put forward by Prof. Booysen with regards to whether the law can play a role, that is still a question that I'm battling with, but because essentially what we have is this concept of a separation of powers, and coalitions is essentially a political arrangement. So the pertinent question then becomes is whether the law can be stretched to intervene in the politics, which is essentially something that must be managed between political parties. So therefore, my argument at this stage is that there is room for guidance policy frameworks that's not that political parties are not bound to follow, but it's going to be difficult to make an argument directing political parties how they should exercise their decision making in a coalition government context. Of course, there is a very fine line that we can draw, and that is where the law may perhaps play a role. And that is if we can put forward the argument that these laws will only apply to the context of the coalition as an institution. So we prescribe laws to really build this institution of a coalition government without necessarily prescribing rules that will inform the decision making of the political parties. So it's more of a regulatory framework within which the political parties must operate. Like in government, in local government, so local government is an autonomous sphere of government, and provincial and national government can't necessarily interfere in the affairs of the government, but national government does prescribe regulatory frameworks within which the local government must exercise their decision making. So it would assume a similar approach. So to that extent, I will limit my argument that to that extent, the law can play a role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennica. That was really helpful, and I think really profound in the sense that it reminded us that just legislative aspects cannot work in own right. They have to articulate with the political culture and political praxis at the time. Thank you so much for that. And then I'm going to move over to Mcebisi Ngoma, a researcher, political economy at MISTRA. Mcebisi, thank you again for participating in this coalition's elections project of MISTRA. And you have got two pieces in this report. The one is about coalition agreements in general to help us reflect on that very important aspect of it. And in the second place, you have got one specifically on the city of Ekurhuleni. And I'm immediately going to throw in one of the questions that came from the audience, and that is whether we can really learn some, can we learn something from Ekurhuleni term 2016 to 2021? And that case, that coalition was stable for 5 years. Did that teach us anything on when coalitions are made to stick, when they are becoming stable? Or was that a total fluke that had happened? Thank you, Mcebisi. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Very, very pertinent questions, I must say. Thank you to Jennica as well, because the piece that I did in the report, both pieces do actually speak a little bit to coalition negotiation, coalition management, and also coalition agreements, right? Trying to see if these kind of procedures and management processes can in fact improve the coalition experience between the different parties, right? And when we look at the Ekurhuleni coalition in particular, it is touted, right, in South Africa as one of the best managed and most stable coalition that emerged between the 2016 to 2021 period, where you have one mayor, right, that actually governed the metro. So you have Mayor Masila, who also then, took time to kind of like look at and reflect on some of the practices and management procedures that actually enabled the coalition in Ekurhuleni to actually be stable. One of the very specific things that he speaks about is that coalitions really need to have ideological proximity between the different political parties. And he also makes the argument in his book that unlike the EFF and DA kind of like a coalition arrangements that emerged during the same period, his coalition partnership within Ekurhuleni actually had people that believed in the same kind of like ideological principles and actually believed and carried on in terms of like the same kind of like party aspirations of non-sexist, non-racial, and transformation of the South African society. One of the things that he does pick up in the book is also that he had a number of coalition meetings that happened within the metro, and also other kind of like coalition political party meetings that happened at a regional level to kind of like stabilize what was happening internally within the metro administration, as well as to stabilize the conversations and agreements that would be happening within the political party sphere. These are very critical points that he mentions in his book that he published, and he ascribes his the success and stability of the political the coalition that he had to that. He also ascribes the fact that he says that his coalition was much more successful than anybody else's because he actually managed to have a clean audit for that period. So that's one success factor. But I think if we relate the Ekurhuleni experience broadly to what happened during the 2016 to 2021 period, in terms of like the different kind of like coalition agreements that happened, that political parties tried to put together, tried to formulate and also formalize, we might learn something about what is happening at this particular current time. Are political parties themselves actually improving the coalition experience? I think that's probably one of the better questions that we are grappling with. And will political parties actually manage to improve their coalition experience, increase and improve service delivery through mechanisms such as different dispute resolution management committees, the ability to talk behind closed doors when there is a dispute, as opposed to kind of like fighting it out in front of the media and destabilizing the agreements. And will political party representatives at national level actually be supportive of your kind of like local and small town, small city kind of like coalitions when there's disruptions that are happening? I think the MISTRA Narratives of Inconvenience book did actually illustrate that the inability of national party leadership to actually intervene in moments of disruption within the metros was one of the factors that actually led to the destabilization of those coalitions. Can we talk about a bit of an emergent culture within the South African political sphere where we see political parties that are trying to actually create mechanisms and ways of speaking to each other, ways of negotiating to actually stabilize the moment of coalitions as we understand it? I do think that if we look at the three political parties, we look at the ANC, we look at the EFF, and also look at the DA, we might be a little bit more kind and reflect on the fact that there are some kind of like mechanics that these political parties are trying to insert into the political culture of coalition formation and negotiation, right? If we look perhaps at the starting point, the initial stance of the Democratic Alliance, it did come to the coalition negotiation moment with a bit of a very well-structured approach, right? Where this Steenhuisen and Zell spoke about the fact that they were actually modeling the kinds of coalitions that were possible and ruling out from that modeling political parties that did not, align their principles and the kinds of governments that they wanted to run in the 2021 to 2026 period. Of course, that was disrupted with that kind of like voting block, moment that emerged on the 23rd of November. Second, the ANC itself, though a bit reticent on its kind of like coalition negotiation and agreement approach, did speak to the fact that it wanted to actually create coalitions with political parties that were actually just constitutionally aligned. Right, it sought to create political coalitions with parties that would adhere, to the rule of law, and of course, speaking to a kind of like a moment where a lot of there was a bit of a discord in terms of speaking about xenophobia, etc., those kinds of things. So the ANC stuck to the ideas of the rule of law in terms of coalition formation. The EFF, I think when we speak about the kinds of words that actually emerge, flash back to the past, the EFF itself did draw up, a couple of list of, I would say, demands that they see, that they thought would be necessary for them to actually enter into any kind of like coalition agreement, specifically directed at the ANC, and of course the ANC did not accede to these. One of them was definitely the fact that any coalition partner would necessarily have to accede to the 6 principles of economic transformation. One of those, of course, being the nationalization of the Reserve Bank and expropriation without compensation and so on. And none of the political parties on the landscape actually did agree to those demands. So you have a range of kind of like stances, postures that political parties kind of like formulated and attempted to kind of like formalize and say, these are the principles upon which we would be necessarily able to actually agree on a coalition. What's important about all of this is that you've got 2 political parties, the EFF and also the DA, who actually did pick up one of the recommendations that we made in the MISTRA book, being that coalition agreements must be formalized, one, publicized, 2, and that citizens in the electorate must be made to understand the kind of arrangement that the political parties are doing. The EFF and DA specifically said that. I did not hear anything from the ANC talking about publicization of whatever kind of like coalition agreement they may have formalized. And indeed, there is talk of the fact that there exists a coalition agreement for the metro, metro, but I've chased that up. I just simply have not been able to find that kind of document. So I think overall, we do have a political culture that is kind of like awakening and becoming astute to how coalitions should be negotiated, how coalitions should be managed, and what kind of agreements must actually be kind of like put forward. And the dispute resolution and the fact that those agreements must try to be as enforceable as possible. But you do have, as Jennica is kind of like implying, a situation where you have to have a match, an alignment between the coalition agreements or procedures with the emergent or current kind of like political culture that we have. I must say, very fairly, just a fair kind of like assessment is that you can see a bit of movement and change and learning from the different political parties in terms of coalition negotiation, the formalization or writing down and coding of the agreements between them. But you do still have the same kind of like challenges in this period where intra-party dynamics and the broader political culture might work to kind of like destabilize the veracity of those kind of like coalition management procedures and instruments that could be put forward. I'll stop there. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Amu. That was very insightful. And yes, that was great in highlighting the role of coalition agreements and the fact that we know so little of what is transpiring in the negotiations, and that even in South Africa with these huge needs for total transparency on coalition agreements, so little in the end gets known. And yes, so many, except at that level where we see, oh, this is a new mayoral committee, unless they're being forced to resign tomorrow. And now the chairpersons of committees are being held out as bait for those who couldn't get onto mayoral committees. Yes, but that was very useful. Thank you so much. And after you, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ndletyana. And Wandile, are you online and can you show your image? Because Wandile will be talking about youth, and we really thought it was very important to include this piece in the report because youth voices generally have been coming through in elections, participation from the more youth elite level, but yet at the lower level, but actually registering and voting very low. And this, in the context of coalitions, that made us wonder, what role are they playing within political parties in reflecting on coalitions and coalitions going into the future? And Wandile, I thank you very much for being willing to apply your mind and your expertise to that topic. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thanks, Prof. Afternoon, everyone. So as Prof says, the section is titled Youth and Coalitions in South Africa, a future hardly spoken about. So the section discusses, of course, the youth voter turnout of 2021, but also compares it to the 2016, just to try and make sense of why there's a decline in voter turnout. Also, the section investigates the role youth have played in shaping party political mandates and the extent to which they influence and shape the coalition partnership decisions across the country. Now, for the focus of this presentation, I will more focus on how the youth of the African National Congress, the youth of the Democratic Alliance and the EFF enter these coalition debates and what they think about them. And so how the youth is thinking about coalitions currently, of course, youth political formations have to contend with the fact that post-election coalitions are becoming prevalent as contemporary politics develop in the country. And youth political formations bear the responsibility of convincing young people to participate in elections. So they have an interest in understanding the formation of coalitions. This is because coalitions affect the youth ability, of course, to get what they vote for, and youth cannot afford not having a position on coalition debates within their political organizations and the political landscape in South Africa broadly. Now, there has been little to no voice or presence of youth wing representatives in public debates or even in coalition negotiation teams formed, of course, after the elections of 2021 across the board within the ANC, the DA Youth, and the EFFSC. And we see this failure of representation in this instance to signal how political youth formations have not developed a strategy or guideline that inform their positions on coalition, and thus have very little influence on coalition decisions in the country. Now, I conducted interviews with members, with leaders, in fact, of the ANC Youth League National Youth Task Team, the EFFSC, and the DA Youth. Now, it's interesting that all these political parties or these political youth formations credit themselves and see them and they see themselves as responsible for getting people to come out and vote in this past election, even though there's been low voter turnout. All three of them say that without the youth's intervention and without the youth's leading of the youth campaign, of the campaign during the 2021 election, there would have been significant drop in the turnout. And the ANC says on the low voter turnout and decrease in votes for the party, the ANC Youth League says there is a need to implement the renewal of the ANC more broadly, and that the youth needs to continue to be included in leadership positions. The DA Youth alluded to the party not resonating with Black youth and says they will have to spend time leading to 2024 reinventing the youth wing and positioning it attractively for young people. While the EFFSC said their challenge is to translate the votes they get in university SRC elections to national and municipal elections, and would be running community-based programs where EFF SC branches will go into neighboring neighborhoods and communities to mobilize and teach young people about the elections. So now we see here, the difference here is that the EFF strategy is going into neighborhoods and teaching about elections, while the DA wants to reposition and restructure their youth organization to be more attractive, and then the ANC Youth League is firm on the issue of renewal to the party in order for the party to do well in the next election. On whether the youth wing had a platform to voice their constituents' views on outcomes of the elections and on the coalition negotiations, the ANC Youth League said they did not have a representative on the coalition task team set up by the NEC, but had a seat on the NEC, and that is where they had a voice on the election outcome and coalition decisions. And the ANC Youth League further said they have not formulated a formal approach or strategy to coalitions, but would have one by 2024 national election. Now, what is interesting is that the ANC Youth League National Youth Task Team currently is not an elected body. And so it will be interesting to see if they will indeed have a document of that nature by 2024. Now, the DA Youth also said they did not have a seat at the party's coalition negotiation team in 2021, But they did say that the DA youth leader has a seat in the Federal Executive Committee, which is the highest decision-making body of the party. And this is where they've been speaking about and trying to drive their youth's agenda on coalitions. Now, the DA youth had something to say about coalitions, and strongly so, which was different from their mother body. And I quote here, we must always take the opportunity to govern where it is available. Again, this is different to the position of the mother body, which feels that we are a good party when we are in opposition. And of course, following the local elections, both the leader of the party and Helen Zille were saying that if need, they did not care to lead. They were very good at being opposition an opposition party. But the DA youth is saying their position was to make sure that where the opportunity comes, they need to take it and lead. And I guess it shows in how when the EFF availed themselves or came to them, many, or at least the DA youth's pride in this election is that they have members of the DA youth being part of mayoral committees and being part of council. And in fact, some of them even being elected as mayors. Now, the EFFSC has been very different. The EFFSC said their leaders does sit on the central command team and the war room, again, which are the highest decision-making bodies of the party. But they did not have a representative, again, on the coalition negotiation team. And to them is that they said they rely on the mother body to continue to lead on the coalition guidelines and choices for the party. They said they trust the elected leaders to make decisions where this is concerned, and reminded me, in fact, that the EFF is not in any coalition, and so it is not for them to enter any debates about coalitions, and that is their debates, I guess, to me. And lastly, so to close, I guess just to say the DA youth seems to be ahead of both the ANC Youth League and the EFFSC in thinking and strategizing about coalitions. And the issue that Joel spoke about earlier of the renewal of the ANC, the identity liberalism of the DA, and the art of mastering the possibility of the political realm of the EFF are things that the youth formations have to contend with and are contending with as we move. Yeah, youth formations are, if youth formations are to prove relevant, they need to take seriously the issue of coalitions in South Africa. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much, Wandile. Those are very useful perspectives. Thank you very much. And, you know, it's such a seamless flow for us here. In a way, our panelists have already been dealing with questions, but quite a few questions have been coming through from the audience. I believe a short while ago, there were 360 people listening to the debate. Thank you very much. Please stay with us. We've got another few minutes, a little while going. I won't mind you if we extend by a few minutes, but just to barge into the questions. For example, there's a few audience members are wondering about the role of social media and the way in which social media may have been affecting the results, especially in the metros. And I'm just going to list a few questions here, but I'm going to ask one of our authors, Graham de Bruin. Graham, you wrote about Swane. I'll ask you in a minute to come on board and maybe reflect on social media and metro results. And perhaps we know the DA did well in Gauteng. And perhaps, Graham, you could also very briefly reflect on what you see as the DA, reasons why the DA is growing, not growing, probably not growing overall, but in certain enclaves it does, and its failure to recruit new colored and Indian voters. And I could also come back to Mcebisi, because one of the questions Mcebisi is about identity politics, and particular race entered identity politics, and in what respects that has been shaping our election results this time around. We know in many other elections previously, there have been debates of the extent to which elections in South Africa may or may not be racial censuses. And so, Mcebisi, what would you say was the impact of identity politics and race overall in this election? I will also want to come to Professor Beukes Mngomezulu. Beukes, hi. And one of the questions I think particularly it could relate to your field, where you did the analysis of the ANC and in ANC then in relation to IFP and other parties, especially in northern KwaZulu-Natal. And to what extent would you say that the ANC is losing control of the levers of power, indeed? Good, and there's also a reminder from the audience, a general point, not directed to anybody in particular, but the very important role that the Party Funding Act and new regulations there had played in this election. That's a very good point. Civil society organizations in general, and whether we see, given their emergence and bigger roles this time around, whether they would also be playing a bigger role in national elections. Of course, that would be more difficult for those organizations to come through, because the big way in which the civil society organizations have been coming through in this election has been in those smaller localities, small local municipalities, and medium-sized in particular, where they can mobilize and win 1 or 2 or even 3 seats in a few places. In a few places, they got like Cedarburg First Residents Association, they got quite a few, and not to mention Independent Civic Organization of South Africa, where they won quite a few and could get big chunks of municipal votes. It will be much more difficult for these organizations to emerge in national and provincial elections unless they start banding together collectively. And so, but anybody feel free to also to reflect on that one. And of course, there was a question to Joel Netshitenzhe, being where you are, Joel. And the question was, please, how do you see the ANC in light of the current election results in 10 years from now? Colleagues, in the order in which I've mentioned now, I think that is Graham, Mcebisi, Beukes, and then Joel. Please, can I ask you to come on board? See if you can answer in 1 minute. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Graham, thanks. Over to you.
Thanks, Prof. So my focus was Tswana, as you indicated, and I talk about it's really a continuity as well as a political stalemate, as the title says about that particular analysis. So in terms of a question about, I want to tackle the one about social media. So if you look at particular, either the Economic Freedom Front, the Democratic Alliance, as well as the ANC, even the main parties, the main thrust of their social media strategy was kind of monologue instead of a dialogue with citizens about what are the critical issues. So I'm not sure if any of those parties mentioned have really harnessed the capacity, as we've seen in other jurisdictions outside South Africa, the extent of the impact of what how they can leverage the social media, and then we can continue on that. In terms of the support of DA, I mean, the reality is that the DA had in 2011, 82 seats in Tswana. In 2016, they had 93 seats. In this year's elections, they ended up with 69 seats. And that will give you some indication. Even though it's not a significant shift, it does represent a kind of a stifled growth. And then creates the opportunity, as you call in the book, Marriages of Inconvenience, that we find ourselves in a zone of multipartyism as well as of coalitions. So that I think is a critical point. And the key point I make in my analysis about the ascendancy and growth of micro-parties, particularly in their ability to be, as everybody often references, kingmakers in these coalition conversations. I do think part of the challenge for the DA, or people should not recognize, there is a fair amount of maturity of people, particularly in Tshwane, in terms of the votes. If you look at one of the areas in Centurion, I think it's in Ward 95, 96, you had a consistent over 2 elections of an overwhelming majority for the Democratic Alliance. So in that regard, at the ward level, one could argue there's been growth, but overall, there's not been. I've made the point about saying that, so I'm going to just finally make the point of saying in Tshwane, part of the reason I think voters should not know what they're voting for, that the DA was part and parcel of what we could call the gridlock that we find ourselves in terms of coalitions. In fact, it was one of the key leaders in the Gauteng made the point of saying is it's part of the arrogance the EFF said in 2016, and part of the lack of leadership, lack of engagement that led to the dissolution of coalitions within Tshwane. And I see no further growth in that area. If you particularly look at the national leadership within the DA, which will have a huge impact of coalition formation, formalization of a broader party coalition formation within Tshwane. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much, Graham. Mcebisi, can I quickly pass the identity question to you before I go to Becky and Joel?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. Video is refusing today. But anyway, and I'm gonna ask, I'm afraid, Sue to leave as soon as I answer this question. I'm beginning to have some competition here in terms of audio.
Mcebisi, there seems to be a lot of interference. Shall I first pass to somebody else and get back to you?
Yes, do that.
Okay, thank you, Mcebisi. Mcebisi may come back in. Let me first go to Becky, Professor Becky Mcebisi. Becky, hi. Given your fascinating piece on Northern KwaZulu-Natal in this report, how would you interpret the question of ANC possibly losing control over levers of power, considering that part of the country, KZN beyond eThekwini? Becky, are you available?
Yes, I can hear you, Prof. No, thank you very much for that question. I'll be very succinct. The reality of the matter here is that the 2021 local government election was a special election, and it shouldn't necessarily paint a picture of the ANC completely losing control of Northern KwaZulu-Natal. Some of the mistakes that the ANC made, in fact, some of the losses that the ANC registered are of its own making. So which means that if they are able to rectify those mistakes, they should be in a position to recover. That is the first point. Then the second point, the decision by opposition political parties to gang up against the ANC is another contributing factor, not necessarily because one or two political parties are getting stronger in Northern KwaZulu-Natal, but it's simply that they all decided to gang up against the ANC, with one leader, in fact, even saying that we are prepared to vote even for a ghost for as long as that ghost is against the ANC. So that is the kind of mentality that is building up. But then, of course, it means that as much as outside factors are to blame for this, the ANC has to correct its own mistakes, starting with the factionalism, starting with the Zuma issue, starting with a number of other national issues, which then indirectly impact on what is happening in that province. Because if you look at the 5 districts that I referred to, the IFP had 3, and then the ANC had 2. And then of the 3 that the IFP got, 2 of them are from the ANC. And the reason they were able to get those districts is primarily because they were able to get support from the other smaller parties. And in fact, for your interest, Susan and colleagues, Ndletyana, which was taken by the IFP, where the ANC was in the majority, by the way. It was taken by the IFP because of this ganging up approach. And then we heard that after 13 days, the mayor resigned. And of course, we are yet to get the exact reasons. He has his own reasons, the party has its own reasons, but the reality of the matter is he had to resign within 13 days. But then, of course, the IFP has replaced him with another one. So the reality of the matter then, Susan, is that as much as the ANC didn't do well in Northern KwaZulu-Natal, there were factors that were responsible for that, and some of them are within the purview of the ANC to correct those mistakes going to the next election. Let me pause there.
Becky, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a very useful perspective, and it reminded us of the fact that the ANC usually also does worse in local government elections than in national and provincial elections. So it is quite possible that it could still bounce back again. Of course, that will depend on quite a few factors relating to internal politics, relating to party funding, etc. And bounce back, we have seen over the years, if we study those election curves. And to readers of MISTRA's report, we have got wonderful trends of the election curve, the election statistics outcomes for the main political parties, including the ANC, in Appendix A. This report is also a fantastic, I really think so, Ebert is our own report, but a fantastic research resource and details on trends and quite a bit of statistics in these elections. And we see that the ANC has never bounced back to that peak of support it had, of course, 69.69% nationally in 2004. And it is quite systematic downwards, but sometimes there are recoveries. So the point is, and therefore, national elections, if we know that it is unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely, that community organizations could make the same kind of impact in national elections as they do in local elections, then that's, and because election support work on percentages, that kind of uptake from small parties is not necessarily going to be there when we get to national elections. But there was a question, is my colleague Joel Netshitenzhe active online? Joel, how you would see the ANC in light of the current local government election results in 10 years from now? Please, may I call on you?
Thank you. I wouldn't want to venture opinions on what will happen in 10 years from now, because if I'm still around, people will want to hold me to it. But the point that I can make is that the inflection moment for the ANC is, in fact, in the current period. And it is being pulled in two directions, if you like, by contradictory imperatives. And that is reaching its head. What are these imperatives? On the one hand, it is trying to pursue self-correction and renewal of the ANC itself, of the state, and of society. On the other is the challenge of building unity and whether this can be achieved whilst accommodating those implicated in malfeasance. The two are not mutually inclusive. And related to this is, of course, the issue of quality of membership. There are members of members, if you like, who seek to use platforms of the ANC to support and protect people in conflict with the law. And in some instances, as was shown in Ndletyana, you also have criminal networks that have sought to take over the structures of the ANC. So fundamentally, what will happen to the ANC in the medium and long term is whether it's able to address those challenges. How does it deal with the issue of quality of membership? Should it consider reopening applications for membership and, for instance, ensuring that every member is able to submit a police clearance certificate? How does it deal with issues to do with lifestyle audits from the bottom to the top and so on. Those are the challenges that it has to address. And if it's unable to do so, then it will be in a serious rut going forward into the next decade. It is possible that these issues can be addressed, but I think in pursuit of that gain, it will have to accept that they will be paid. In addition to this are fundamental questions about performance on macro social issues, the economy, energy, quality of life, especially of the poorest of the poor. Also understanding that you might not satisfy all the aspirations all at once, but there should be trust and hope in society that something is being done about their conditions. So briefly, what one is saying is that in 10 years, where the ANC will depend on those factors within the ANC and also its performance as the leading party in government. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joel. Much appreciated. It's a question that has been coming through directly here to me, has been about protest, and already there is quite a bit of agitation from communities, as we've also heard from Mcebisi earlier. Unfortunately, Mcebisi had to drop off the call, but about insistence for the Northern Alliance supporters in communities and how the pressures are mounting. We have seen examples of community mobilization to affect these elections, even if it's local issues, on the eve of the 2019 elections, with a protest in Alexandra Township outside Johannesburg against DA administration at the time, which I think was hugely successful in affecting those election outcomes. In quite a few communities we've seen just in the last month, it is unabated protest and insisting that the new councillors come and address their issues. And that's one aspect that was very important of the current bout of elections. We're still living the aftermath of it, that there is a sense of hyper accountability, and so much of the service delivery deficits and problems were right in the public view. And so this kind of accountability, I think there's been a change of political culture in more of it coming to the fore, and it being unabated and kind of relentless in pressures on communities, and where the coalitions in the towns and cities are very, very narrow and comprising so many elements that can be swayed to other parties and their coalitions. It is indeed a roller coaster ride that is coming in here. I've got one of my author colleagues, Nkwe Moncha, who hasn't had a chance just to say a few quick words again. And Nkwe, are you active online? Because then you did reviews, or some of the quick short reviews on 3 other provinces, Free State, Limpopo, and the Northwest. And I wonder whether you have any reflections there on possible stability and instability in those provinces. Thank you very much. I know it's 3 provinces, but just a brief minute or so will be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. What we see in the, can you hear me?
Great, perfect, thank you. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. What we see in the Northwest, in Limpopo and in Free State, it's the coming in of the community-based parties, where you would check in Free State. In Free State, we find that in Metsimahulu, Malitiapofung, and in Motlaka, there are smaller community parties that came in. Remember that Free State was being hit by corruption allegations and poor service deliveries by the leading party, the ANC. we find that in that area, the smaller parties that were contesting in the 2021 elections, they've decided that they wouldn't be working with the ANC, but at the same time, we also have the MAP16 movement. MAP16 movement, remember, it's a party that was formed by 16 suspended councillors from the ANC. They've come in and also they've come in and formed a coalition with the EFF in Maluti Apofum. They came in there, and for them, it was about saying we can make it for our own communities. After being expelled, I don't know if you can you hear me, Prof?
Yes, we can. We can. Please,
can I just recap quickly on this?
Please continue.
Okay.
Okay, shall I? I think Nkwe's got problems with his system there. Yes, but I think while Nkwe is recovering his system there, indeed, I think one of the very important points also is broader reference here that you've mentioned there, Nkwe, has been the different kind of roles that small kingmaker parties have been assuming here. And the EFF has played a fascinating role in this election, in the aftermath of the election, and coming through with support, for example, of MAP16, and that there, and in Metsimaholo, but there its mayor was elected with the support of the ANC and was asked to withdraw. And so a few of the municipalities, we also see the EFF and DA, for example, coming out in unlikely type of alliances, not coalitions, but in a sense of confidence and supply agreements, and giving tacit support in many different ways. So we also see in terms of these confidence and supply agreements that there are really quite a few iterations coming through, sometimes just agreeing with the DA, for example, agreeing not to oppose, and being in de facto alliances. So this is actually a new type of politics that are coming into South Africa that has been shaping the aftermath of these elections and are bound to continue new dynamics. And it depends on so many factors, as Joel has also outlined here, what the different configurations in the ANC are and whether the ANC can redeem itself. And just one final point here from me is in relation to the EFF and the ANC and ANC factionalism. We have seen, because of pressures on so many of these ANC nomination processes, to have a balance between factions, that in quite a few of the municipalities, we can think eThekwini, we can think several other municipalities in Mpumalanga, fascinating to watch. I cover a few of that in an omnibus type of chapter that I have got in the report. But different factions of the ANC coming in and voting in different kind of configurations with all sorts of opposition parties in those councils. In some cases, the African Transformation Movement, pro-Zuma days, mostly in last election that they came through, also playing a role, but sometimes forming willing coalitions, even against ANC. But one-person parties can go a long way, a lot of leeway to cover in which they can operate there. Alex, I do not see, thank you very much. I see the audience has stayed with us in a big way. Thank you very much for that. And I see no further questions coming up because we're largely over time. But with this discussion, we had to go over time. Thank you very much, audience, to stay with us. But I've got one final point here, and I'm just going to ask my colleague Abba Umar to just do the formal word of thanks. And thank you very much, everybody in the audience and all my fellow authors on this report. Thank you so much for your participation in this event. But Abba Umar, Director Operations at MISTRA, thank you very much for having a final word and doing our thank yous for MISTRA. Thank you very much. Over to you, Abba.
Great stuff. Thank you. So, colleagues and friends, thank you for remaining with us, even though we've gone a little bit over time. We should have probably given more time for this discussion, and given the interest that's being expressed, I don't blame people for wanting to stay for even a little while longer. So a report like this titled When Wedding Bells Toll obviously raised a lot of questions. And when we were deciding on the title, when this title was going around, someone thought one of our colleagues was going to get married. So we had to quickly correct that. She wasn't announcing her marriage or anything. And then, people often wondered for whom the wedding bells toll. And I think this is an important question as we go forward. And I think that's a perspective we'll need to keep when looking at this report and the book that MISTRA released a few months ago around marriages of convenience, that these are the bases of discussions. So instead of asking Joel Netshitenzhe where he sees the ANC going to be in 10 years' time, I hope that the research that we have provided can help for a lot of those kind of discussions. The research here and in the book has thrown a lot of light on a number of issues, whether, as you picked up in today's session, identity politics, the issue of the impact of the July uprisings, the impact of corruption, poor service delivery, factionalism, etc. And that's not just in the ANC. It's impacted on the DA and the EFF and other parties as well. So let's keep that in mind. I think the one thing we do know, we kind of wondered whether we should include that all coalitions like marriages need an ANC. They do need an anti-nuptial contract. So they need to be able to be guided by something or the other, as the report indicates also, the kind of basis of the coalition. So hopefully going forward, that's what we'll be able to take. But there are other areas that the report sort of identifies that we need to look at. And I think one is the issue of our democracy. Are we seeing this continuous sort of erosion of our democracy as good for our country? It really delegitimizes the different levels of the state. And what are we going to be seeing by 2024? Is this going to be the downward trend, or are we going to see a shift? We also interesting sort of things that emerge from the report are like the role of ex-public servants and whether they're coming into leading political parties, former anti-apartheid activists, as you saw, leading civic organizations, that kind of thing. So I think these are questions we need to look at as we get to 2024, because I have no doubt that this kind of lessons of coalitions is going to be really important for all parties to look at. And in that light, I want to firstly thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the FES, for their support, because as you know, a coalition government is part of the DNA now of German politics. They've been having coalitions on and off for a long time. It's the first time we've had 3 parties being part of a national coalition government, but very interesting. So thank you very much for your support, colleagues from FES. Vielen Dank, as they would say in German. And I think the important thing is that we hope we can rely on you for the continued discussion we want beyond today's event and beyond this report up to 2024 around coalitions and so forth. Then a big thank to Business Day Dialogues for working with us in this hosting platform. Thank you. Big thanks to our backroom staff, Norma, Sipokazi from MISTRA, Monica and Megan for putting the publication together under crazy deadlines, and obviously to Amara and Sandy from Business Day. Then the actual workers, the producers of the report, a big thank you, all the researchers. Some of you have been on this panel, you worked under really tight deadlines. And I think biggest big thanks is to Professor Susan Booysen I think you've pulled off a mini miracle here. It wasn't easy. I know I kept standing back, but I know how pressured you were working round the clock in producing this thing so that we could get it out before the silly season hits South Africa. As we know, the silly season starts in 2 days' time from December 16. So big thanks to you. To all the participants, all colleagues who have attended, members of the audience, we hope that you would continue joining us for future MISTRA events, reading our reports, contributing as researchers. Some exciting stuff's coming up. The next big milestone is our report on the transition to a low carbon future. I hope you attend that event. So be safe, enjoy the festive season, come back safe next year. All the best. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abba. Thank you very much, audience. I declare the meeting over. Please read the report, engage with us, and we look forward to taking this forward in next year when we will also be launching our coalitions barometer. Thank you very much. All the best.